In the summer of 1914, Europe's great powers still called themselves civilized, and they were one diplomatic note away from general mobilization. Here, in a Belgrade embassy office, an Austrian envoy laid a typed page on the desk and started a 48-hour clock. And the story you were taught says one gunshot in Sarajevo explains everything that followed. This is the story of how a 10-point ultimatum, a blank check, and a mobilization timetable turned a Balkan crisis into a continent-wide war, and why diplomacy could not hit pause once the machine started. This is No History. The usual story says World War I began because an archduke was shot in Sarajevo. But July 1914 was not a straight line from one murder to one declaration. It was a world of binding alliances, discretionary guarantees, embassy ultimatums, and rail plans that moved faster than any cabinet could safely reverse. How did Europe's 1914 decision system keep accelerating even when diplomats offered concessions? That is the investigation ahead. Picture the textbook version. A royal motorcade in Sarajevo. A bomb, a wrong turn, a pistol shot. A grieving empire demands justice. And within weeks, Europe is at war. That chain feels clean because it is human. We understand anger, assassination, revenge. Historians have never denied Sarajevo mattered. Franz Ferdinand's death gave Vienna a moral language for punishment. It also gave every newspaper a villain and a date. That is why the assassination-only story survives. It is vivid. It is simple. It was the spark. But a spark only becomes a fire when the room is already full of fuel, vents, and wind. The popular version skips the paperwork. It skips the telegrams. It skips the timetables that turned diplomacy into operations. A Serbian reply on 25th of July met almost every Austrian demand, and Europe still marched into general mobilization within a week. That is the clue this episode is not about one gunshot. It is about alliances, guarantees, and rail timetables that kept accelerating once switched on. Here is the crack in the simple story. On 25th of July, Serbia answered Austria's 10-point ultimatum. The reply was not defiance. Belgrade accepted almost every demand, with reservations on a few clauses that touched sovereignty. Vienna was not satisfied, and Europe still marched toward general mobilization within days. If the war were only about punishing Serbia for Sarajevo, a largely compliant answer should have cooled the crisis. It did not. Vienna broke diplomatic relations anyway. Russia answered with military measures. Berlin read that as a threat to German security. So what was already running underneath the diplomacy? Before we answer whether any cabinet could still halt mobilization once rail plans were running, we need to see how the blank check and ultimatum clock set the machine in motion. Start with what the archives show in sequence, not emotion, but commitments. After Sarajevo, on 28th of June, Vienna sought a reckoning. For 3 weeks, Europe still looked like a diplomatic crisis, not yet a continental war. That gap matters. Germany's leadership faced a strategic fear, an encircled continental war if Russia backed Serbia and France honored its alliance. This is entente versus alliance in practice, not one bloc, two geometries. The Triple Alliance bound Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy on paper. The Franco-Russian alliance bound Paris and St. Petersburg with military specificity. Britain stood in a different category. On 5th and 6th of July, Emperor Franz Joseph's envoy in Berlin secured something historians call the blank check. Not a literal blank banknote. A promise that Berlin would back Austria-Hungary even if punitive action against Serbia meant a wider war. That changed Vienna's risk calculation. With Berlin's backing, Vienna could plan punishment without assuming it stood alone. Foreign Minister Berchtold and military advisors debated how hard to press Serbia. The answer was not a single bullet. It was a document designed to force a public crisis. 3 weeks later, the harsh option arrived in Belgrade. At 6 in the evening, the clock started. The 10-point ultimatum was designed to be unacceptable, or to compress time so completely that other capitals could not coordinate a mediation. Some demands required Serbian courts to let Austria investigate conspirators on Serbian soil. Others demanded suppression of anti-Austrian propaganda and removal of officials. Taken together, the note asked Belgrade to accept a kind of protectorate status. That is why historians still debate whether any reply could have satisfied Vienna once Berlin had already pledged support. A 48-hour deadline is not just drama. It is a logistical weapon. Other capitals had very little time to coordinate mediation before the deadline. Mediation proposals could not outrun the deadline. When the deadline passed, Serbia had answered. Vienna judged the reply insufficient and moved toward war anyway. Russia began moving in support of Serbia. Tsarist ministers argued over how far to go without triggering Germany. They chose partial measures first. France, bound by alliance to Russia, faced its own clock. Britain was different. London's decision was not automatic on 23 July. The Liberal cabinet was divided between interventionists and those fearing continental entanglement. Irish Home Rule politics pressed on the same government that might send an expeditionary force. So Britain watched July with a different calculus than Paris or Berlin. It would hinge on invasion routes, treaty honor, and domestic politics, including Belgian neutrality. If German armies marched through Belgium to outflank France, Britain's choice could harden overnight. Meanwhile, German planners had spent years translating strategy into rail timetables. The Militärfahrplan was not a vague intention to fight. It assigned units to specific trains, on specific days, on specific platforms. Civilians saw railway timetables. Generals saw a synchronized machine. That machine assumed general mobilization meant full deployment, not a reversible gesture. Historians widely argue that once general mobilization began, reversing course did not mean sending troops home. It meant colliding schedules, stranded troops, exposed frontiers, and advantage handed to the enemy. Operationally and politically extremely costly, with little time left for diplomacy. Moltke and his colleagues had spent years gaming these timetables against French and Russian responses. Their diary evidence does not show planners simply hungering for war, but their professional world measured success in hours of mobilization gained or lost. That is why the delayed question matters. Could any cabinet have hit pause once those rail plans were running? Historians widely argue that by late July, once general mobilization began, reversing course was operationally and politically extremely costly, leaving little time for diplomacy. On the 30th July, Russia ordered general mobilization. Germany issued an ultimatum demanding demobilization. St. Petersburg could not comply without leaving allies exposed. On the 1st of August, Germany declared war on Russia. France mobilized in response. On the 3rd of August, Germany declared war on France. German planning required speed through Belgium. When German forces crossed Belgium, British restraint collapsed. Belgian neutrality was not abstract morality in Whitehall. It was a legal tripwire tied to cabinet politics and empire trade routes. Foreign Secretary Grey had spent July trying to convene mediation. By early August, speeches still mattered, but schedules had already chosen the menu, not because one archduke died, because a regional ultimatum
had already been wired into alliance geometry and general mobilization machinery. By 4th August 1914, Britain entered the war. A Balkan dispute had become a multi-power armed confrontation through linked decisions, not a single shot. Italy, nominally allied to Vienna and Berlin, would later choose neutrality in 1914. The point is not that alliances were mindless. Leaders still chose. They chose inside a machine that rewarded speed and punished hesitation. So what actually happened? Diplomacy in July 1914 was real. Kaiser Wilhelm, the Tsar, and other rulers exchanged telegrams into the final days. Those messages show panic, not cartoon villainy. They also show how little personal appeal could slow a timetable once general mobilization began. But it ran inside alliance commitments and military timetables. Military planners had translated politics into schedules long before the ultimatum expired. Once timetables started, leaders faced increasingly binary choices with little room for fine adjustments. 1914 escalated because alliances, guarantees, and rail clocks were built to move faster than diplomats could safely break. The assassination triggered a pre-wired July sequence. German backing on 5th to 6th July. The timed 10-point ultimatum and 48-hour deadline. Alliance-linked mobilizations. And Militärfahrplan, rail plans, that shrank the diplomatic pause button to almost nothing. Could a cabinet have halted general mobilization cleanly once trains were moving? Historians widely argue that reversing course was operationally and politically extremely costly, not without risking military disaster and political humiliation.
Leaders often faced choices that felt binary: mobilize or accept perceived weakness, rather than fine-grained tuning. Serbia's conciliatory reply did not fail because diplomats were irrational. Belgrade offered to submit disputed clauses to international arbitration. Vienna treated partial acceptance as a reason to escalate, not to negotiate. It failed because Vienna wanted a confrontation enabled by Berlin's guarantee, and because St. Petersburg, Paris, and Berlin were already translating each telegram into mobilization risk. Each step narrowed the next diplomatic option. By the time leaders spoke of peace, the trains were already claiming priority. The same document that looked like a diplomatic note was already wired into mobilization machinery Europe could not easily unwind. This July crisis reminds us that catastrophe is often a scheduling problem dressed as politics. But 1914 opens a wider question about how we narrate war itself. Do we keep telling the story as tragedy with a single face when the evidence keeps showing systems? This changes how we read World War I, not as an inevitable horror story, but as a system failure, where speed was built into institutions on purpose. Each mobilization step narrowed the next diplomatic option. By August, schedules mattered as much as speeches. That is the lesson that outlives 1914. When institutions optimize for speed, alliances, guarantees, mobilization plans, they can quietly trade away the option to stop. Think of the 48-hour ultimatum as an early 20th century version of a high-speed deadline. The note looked diplomatic. The machinery behind it was already military. This raises a harder question. When institutions build plans for speed, do they quietly trade away the option to stop? On No History, we trace how the mechanisms behind major turning points actually worked, not just who won or lost. If a blank check, a 10-point ultimatum, and a 48-hour deadline could still end in general mobilization, which modern system today has the weakest pause button? Alliance guarantees, supply chain timetables, or automated deployment schedules?